Today I'm going to show you the little-known Rousseau Gambit, an underrated opening that can completely shock your opponents. With just a few precise moves, we start the game with the pawn moving to e4. Black replies with a pawn to e5, and then white usually continues with knight to f3 and bishop to c4. These are very standard opening moves, seen not only in amateur games but also at the professional level. Normally, in this position, black develops a knight or a bishop, following traditional opening principles. But instead of all that, you are going to surprise your opponent with the move pawn to f5. This will come as a real shock, because it breaks the usual patterns they expect. Most players realize that black is aiming to capture the central pawn on e4, so they react to that threat. Some players immediately capture the pawn on f5, while others defend the pawn on e4 by pushing pawn to d3. Another common choice is developing the knight to c3 to protect it. Surprisingly, none of these moves are correct. The best response for white, spoiler alert, is to play pawn to d4. That is the most challenging move, but even then, the position remains sharp, unclear, and full of great opportunities for black. Let's begin by looking at the most natural responses from white. One of the most common moves played by thousands of players is knight to c3. At first glance, it seems logical, but in fact it is one of the fastest ways for white to lose. Here is why. After knight to c3, you immediately exchange pawns on e4. Then you push your pawn to d5, which creates a double attack on white's two minor pieces, the knight on e4 and the bishop on c4. Since white cannot save them both, you will inevitably capture one, leaving white in a hopeless position. It is effectively game over, and remarkably, you can win in as little as 5 moves. Now let's step back a few moves and examine some of white's other common options. Instead of knight to c3, white often chooses either to capture your pawn on f5 or to defend their pawn on e4 by pushing their pawn to d3. Let's start with the capture, since it is actually the most frequent reaction by white. However, this move is completely mistaken. The moment white takes on f5, you gain the chance to launch a powerful counterattack. You can either advance your pawn to e4, directly attacking the knight on f3, or push your pawn to d5, attacking the bishop on c4 while also opening the diagonal for your own bishop to join the battle. The idea behind white capturing your pawn on f5 is that they hope to regain material balance. However, this move backfires badly because it allows you to expand rapidly while forcing white's pieces into retreat. After pawn takes f5, you immediately push your pawn to e4. This creates a serious problem for white because the knight on f3 suddenly has nowhere good to go. At first glance, it may seem that the knight has plenty of squares available, but when you look closer, you see the truth. The central squares are controlled by black's knight, while the squares on the king side are covered by your queen. This means that every natural escape square for the knight is already under black's control. The only remaining option for white is the humiliating retreat knight back to g1, undoing all of their development and leaving them in a miserable position. Of course, this sad retreat gives you free rein to keep attacking, keep expanding, and seize the initiative completely. At this stage, many of your opponents will start to realize they are already in deep trouble, despite being only a few moves into the game. For most players, putting the knight all the way back to g1 feels far too depressing. So instead, many of them try queen to e2, hoping to pin your pawn and take advantage of the situation. At the same time, they are often thinking that you must be an inexperienced player throwing out random, unsound moves, and that they should be able to punish you quickly. But the moment white plays queen to e2, you calmly respond with queen to e7, mirroring their move. This unpins your pawn and immediately renews the threat of capturing white's knight. Now white has no choice. They must retreat the knight to g1 anyway. From here, you continue developing naturally with knight to f6, preparing the strong move pawn to d5, which will drive away white's bishop from c4. At this point, most players with white realize that your pawn on e4 is extremely annoying, since it blocks their development, especially their knight on g1. That's why they usually push pawn to d3, hoping to trade it off. But this is exactly where you get to spring another powerful idea. Instead of trading right away, you strike with knight to d4. This move attacks white's queen directly, while at the same time threatening the vulnerable pawn on c2, which would fork the king and the rook. It is a beautiful, resourceful idea that can completely turn the tables and punish white for underestimating your opening. Since your knight on d4 threatens the pawn on c2, white must try to protect it. But no matter where the queen moves, you simply continue with knight takes c2. This brilliant combination appears out of nowhere and forces white into a terrible dilemma. If white does not capture your knight, you will immediately win the rook, since the knight is forking both the king and the rook. When white finally takes your knight with the queen, you follow up with pawn takes d3. This comes with a discovered check against the white king, while at the same time attacking white's queen. On the very next move, you will capture it. After just 9 moves, the game is completely over, and white has no hope. It's an absolutely crushing line, and one of the main reasons this gambit is so underrated and yet so deadly. Now let's go back to the earlier position. This system is known as the Rousseau Gambit, although the pronunciation can be a little uncertain since it is such a rare opening. If you happen to know the proper way to pronounce it, let me know in the comments. Another common reaction from white occurs after they capture your pawn on f5 and you push your pawn forward to e4, driving away their knight. At this moment, they often accept reality and retreat the knight all the way back to g1. Here, there is one small but important detail to be aware of. By pushing your f-pawn forward early, you slightly weaken the diagonal leading to your king. This means that in many variations of the Rousseau Gambit, white might try queen to h5, giving check. While this move is not devastating, black can even ignore it and push pawn to d5, there is an easier way to stop it altogether. Simply play knight to f6, which covers the h5 square and prevents white's queen from even appearing there. After this, you are ready to push your pawn to d5 on the very next move, kicking away white's bishop on c4 and opening the diagonal for your own bishop. The position turns out beautifully for black, and you are the one dictating the play. After white plays pawn to d3, their goal is simple. They want to trade off your strong pawn on e4 so they can finally regain some space and develop their pieces. Now you strike with d4. Once their bishop retreats and you recapture the pawn, it quickly becomes clear that black is already dominating the position. You control the center, while white's pieces remain cramped on the back rank. Everything looks great for you, and the initiative is entirely in your hands. To illustrate how things might unfold, let's look at some typical continuations from actual games in the database. You don't need to memorize these moves exactly. The main point is that black's development comes naturally and leads to a powerful attack. For example, if white exchanges pawns in the center, you can recapture with your knight. This not only restores material balance, but also plants a strong outpost right in the middle of the board. Knight f3, then bishop to c5, you simultaneously develop and put immediate pressure on white's position. If white castles kingside, you simply castle as well, and it is clear that you are ahead in development with powerful attacking chances. Your pieces, the knight, the bishop, and even the rook once it joins, are all aiming toward the kingside, setting up for a dangerous assault. Now, one of the most popular moves from white here is knight to d2, but this runs into a beautiful tactical shot. You sacrifice with knight takes f2. At first glance, it looks reckless, but the idea is to rip open the white king's defenses. After the capture, you follow up with knight to d4, another killer move that piles on threats, attacking the bishop, the pawn on c2, and applying pressure in coordination with your other pieces. If white gets greedy and captures your knight, you immediately strike with bishop takes c2, which not only attacks the queen but also unleashes a discovered check from your rook against the king. White is completely lost, since you will win the queen and keep your attack rolling against the exposed king. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.